Good morning. Um, Jeff asked me sometime earlier in the week to speak on the theology and the philosophy of the great Black influential Christian Howard Thurman, a man who had a very large and significant impact on the civil rights movement, particularly in its understanding and use of nonviolence as a viable method for social change and revolution. I didn't watch the previous presentations that Jeff delivered on Howard Thurman. However, you may be aware that he was a thinker, a scholar, and a Black theologian who was an intellectual forerunner of the civil rights movement. In fact, so profoundly influential that he was that the Reverend Andrew Young, who was a chief companion and lieutenant of Dr. Martin Luther King, said that Dr. King kept a copy of his book uh, entitled Jesus and the Disinherited in his briefcase on his constant travels. Howard Thurman was born in 1899 and raised by his formerly enslaved grandmother. He grew up to be an ordained minister and, as I said, a leading figure for change in the 20th century, a leading thinker. That his thinking and his philosophy helped to inspire a movement for change. Now, I want to go back. He was raised by I thought it was very fascinating that he was raised by his grandmother who had been enslaved. I want you, and I connect with that because my grandmother herself was the granddaughter and daughter of slaves. My great grandmother, who died in 1940, Martha Jamison, was born a slave herself. And I indeed met a slave when I was a child. I was 6 years old in Mississippi. I remember talking to a man, a Black man, close to 100 years old at the time, who himself had been born a slave. So the backdrop of slavery here gives me a powerful connection to this man, Howard Thurman. What's significant about him is that in 1936, the Reverend Howard Thurman, he was an ordained minister, led a 4-member delegation to India, to Burma, Ceylon, Burma, which is now Myanmar, and Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka, and it was known as the Pilgrimage of Friendship. It was during the nonviolent struggle being led by Mohandas K. Gandhi, known respectfully as Mahatma Gandhi, or affectionately by his followers and adherents as the Mahatma. And at the time, Gandhi was leading a nonviolent struggle against the oppressive and stifling rule of the British. The visit was sponsored by an organization called the Student Christian Movement, and they wanted to explore the political connections between the oppression of Blacks in the United States and the freedom struggle of Indians in India. A man by the name of A. Rela Ram, who was the general secretary of the Indian Student Christian Movement, wanted to invite a Negro delegation because Christianity was a faith and religion that he saw and that the Indians saw as a tool of oppression used by the British, as was the case in the United States. You need to understand that Christianity, the church in the United States, has crawled into the bed with white supremacy. It's committed adultery with white supremacy in the United States, and it's taken on the values of the culture of white supremacy in the United States. And that was certainly the case and the understanding in India at the time. During the time that Thurman was speaking in India, he was repeatedly asked about the impotency, which is the seeming powerlessness of the Christian church to address color consciousness, racism, caste, and inequality, and the fact that the white church, as I said before, reflected the values of the dominant and oppressive culture. Eventually, the Reverend Thurman met with the great figure Mahatma Gandhi, who was then, as I said earlier, leading the nonviolent struggle against British oppression in India. During a 3-hour conversation, Gandhi questioned his guest, Howard Thurman, or the Reverend Howard Thurman, about racial segregation in the U.S. He asked him about lynchings, which were even during that time, were still all too pervasive in the United States. They were occurring all over the United States with little to no redress. And the church did not mount the church did not address these kinds of heinous acts of murder. And it was not, the church is unfortunately an institution that has risen in some part to its calling, has embraced its calling belatedly. As a matter of fact, in the 1960s, one of the greatest enemies of the civil rights movement was the Christian church in the United States. I hesitate to say that, but it's a fact. Gandhi wondered why African Americans adopted the religion of their masters, Christianity. He reasoned that, at least in the religion of Islam, all were considered equal. He told Howard Thurman, he said this: for the moment a slave accepts Islam, he obtains equality with his master. And there are several instances of this in history, he said. But he did not think it was true in Christianity. Actually, unfortunately, it wasn't. If a slave became a Christian, it did not mean that he would experience equality with the master, nor did it mean that he would be freed from slavery in the United States. Gandhi, Thurman was asked, Gandhi replied that Christianity is identified with Western culture and colonialism, and it was the greatest enemy to Jesus Christ in India. Thurman went on to ask him about his notion of nonviolence, his notion of love, his notion of his tactics of nonviolence, and how they were attempting to overthrow British colonial rule. Gandhi went on to explain to him that nonviolence was not a passive kind of behavior, a passive tool, but it was indeed an active and powerful tool. And I want to go on and make a connection to nonviolence here in the United States, as it was used during the civil rights struggle here in the United States, particularly in the Jim Crow South. Now, I grew up in the Jim Crow South, and let me tell you something. The church was in bed with white supremacists. The church had no prophetic, offered no prophetic resistance to the notion of white supremacy. As a matter of fact, in many cases, it was afraid to speak out. If you've read the letters from the pastors in Montgomery, Alabama, to Martin Luther King when he was in jail, they said that he was moving too far, too fast, and that nonviolence and that the nonviolent demonstrations themselves were inappropriate, would cause harm, and would upset the peace of the city of Montgomery. And I want to just tell you something about nonviolence. I think nowadays we question nonviolence and its impotency and its potency, shall I say, its strength. The reason that nonviolence was so profound in the South is that it rests on several factors. The South being different from other places, the demographics of the South allowed, or the culture of the South, in the culture of the South, blacks and whites mingled uh, together in work. Black people worked in white people's homes. They worked in their businesses. They took care of their children. They provided the cheap labor that white people needed to make a profit and to benefit from them. They benefited from the cheap labor economically. So in the South, it was a different. Now, blacks were never on equal footing with whites, of course. Everything was segregated. The churches were segregated. Theaters were segregated. Universities were segregated. Everything was segregated. And this was no walk in the park. And I can tell you numerous stories about how my parents, what they told me and how they tried to protect me from segregation. Because if there were segregated signs saying white restrooms, colored restrooms, and my mother and my father told me, if you go into a white restroom, I guarantee you that you will not come out alive. So challenging this system of segregation was never a walk in the park. Was never going to be you. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine told me once, who grew up during that time too. He said that getting involved in a demonstration at that time was not like getting involved in a demonstration here. You might have a police reaction. You might go to jail here. You might get arrested. But in the South at the time, if you signed up to get involved in a nonviolent demonstration, the police were watching you. Everybody knew who you were, and you would probably end up, most likely, in the morgue. So it was a different kind of system. Now, the reason that nonviolence was so powerful in the South is this: is that when blacks began to resist white domination, what they did was this: they seized upon a tool called the economic boycott. And what they did, because they lived in so close proximity to whites, they began to say, no, we're not going to patronize your businesses. We're not going to do your work. We're going to form our own collectives. And those kinds of things begin to cause some economic pain in the white community. White businesses oftentimes would go belly up because they depended on black patronage to succeed. So if you engaged in an act of nonviolent resistance, you were beginning to undermine the system itself. Not only that, there was the economic boycott. Blacks were beginning to ask to demand to vote. In the South, one Mississippi governor said this. He said that if we have to hang every Negro in the state to maintain white supremacy, we will do that. And to make sure that the Negro does not vote, we will visit him in the night with guns and ropes and make sure that he will not show up at the polls. So this is a system of violence. And so nonviolent resistance in the South was very, 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 Dr. King called it the social earthquake. And indeed it was the social earthquake. The other component of nonviolent resistance was a demand for education, a demand for equal education. The states of the South completely underfunded Black education. the white universities and the white schools were given the maximum amount uh, of financial appropriations for their programs and for their students' educational attainment. And Blacks began to demand that they be allowed into these schools. That created havoc. Uh, and and whites mounted in the South and throughout the nation at that time too, what we call now the massive resistance to equality, the massive resistance. Uh, and Howard Thurman, in his writings on nonviolence, nonviolence is a very profound concept in the sense that it 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 it's contradictory to the force of it's contradictory to violence, and violence is what the nation was founded upon. It gained its wealth through violence. It gained its wealth through the appropriation of Indian lands, and nonviolence, on the other hand, requires a commitment of the soul, a commitment of love, a commitment of peace, but an uncompromising demand for justice. And that is the contribution that Howard Thurman made to the civil rights movement. The civil rights leaders in the beginning began to say, how do we contravene a system itself that is so violent, that is so treacherous, that is so oppressive? And unfortunately, the church, I have to say, the church was not on the side of justice. My hope in the future is that the church begins to become more of a beacon, begins to uh, loosen or break the shackles and the bonds that the shackles and the bonds of white supremacy, and began to become this beacon of hope, this beacon of change, and this beacon and reflect the true teachings of Christ, the true teachings of equality, the teachings of revolution. Thank you.